right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Combat Imposter Syndrome. I see that we have quite a few participants who are just joining right now. It's at the top of the hour. As you're joining, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat function. If you switch chat to talk to all panelists and attendees, we'd love to start a quick introduction. So if you'll just put in the chat box, what is something, an accomplishment of yours that you're most proud of? So we'll start that as today's introduction. We'll get started in just a minute or two as people are getting online. But if you'll start filling out the chat, again, if you just want to answer into the chat box, what is an accomplishment that you're proud of? We'll get started in just a few minutes. Again, when you're in the chat, make sure it is in the to line. It says to all panelists and attendees. All right, looking at some of these, becoming a grad student at 35, that's incredible. Okay, we have someone here from Michigan who just started their own business, changing careers at 35, owning my own home, getting a full scholarship to law school, teaching myself how to make costumes. This is great. Also love the people who are sharing where they're from. Thank you for that. Being named as the top 24 under 24 by Spark Action. These are great. Again, for those of you who are just joining us, we're gonna get started in just a moment, having people do quick introductions in the chat. When you're in the chat, you'll wanna make sure that the to line says to all panelists and attendees. And if you just share an accomplishment of yours that you're proud of, we'll include that in the chat. All right. Getting to the final stage of PhD, deciding to run for office and doing it. Congratulations, Tammy, so proud of you. I'm seeing a couple people too who are noticing like, this is a really hard question to answer. I asked it intentionally. And if it's okay if that's a hard question to answer, we'll talk about that throughout today's session. People who are proud of the years that they've spent caring for a spouse, changing my life with 4 children, and now I'm still making life better. Working in city government, running for office and winning. Congratulations, Mary Jane. Getting into your art into a gallery show. Congratulations, Chelsea. Oh, sorry, you're from Chelsea. You are Chelsea from Phoenix. Okay, perfect. Congratulations, Chelsea. All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. In addition to letting me know some of the accomplishments of yours, feel free to use the chat throughout today's session. So we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for making the time to be here today. We'll start with just a quick introduction of who She Should Run is, who I am, and what we're going to cover today. So She Should Run was founded in 2011, and Kathleen, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. She Should Run was founded in 2011. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that encourages women from all walks of life to see their leadership potential and to consider running for office. Our aim is to dramatically increase the number of women considering a run for office. And we do that through educational resources, through trainings, and through community. So this is one of the efforts that we do. Today we'll be talking about imposter syndrome because it's one of the largest barriers that stand in the way of women running for office. We can go back, some reminders to have in your mind as we go through today's session is that this session is being recorded. So if you get knocked off or you have a friend you want to share it with afterwards, that will be available for you. If you would like to have closed captioning, that is available live today. If you just hit the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to see captions for today's webinar. The chat is available for us to use throughout the duration of today's conversation, so feel free to put any thoughts or ideas or questions in there. However, when we do get to the Q&A section of today's conversation with Rosemary, there is a Q&A box specifically at the bottom of your screen. I ask that you do use that if you have questions for Rosemary at the end of this session. And finally, as we complete today, there will be an evaluation. It takes about 3 minutes to complete and allows us to ensure that we're giving you the best content to be able to engage with leadership and consider running for office as an option for yourself. So with that, I'll also introduce myself. My name is Jadinette Santos. I'm the Political Pipeline Director here at She Should Run. In my role, I focus on all activities, curriculum, and programs that aim to get women to consider running for office and providing the resources and education that they need to be able to transition from considering it to mapping out what running for office could actually look like, whether that's brushing up on some leadership skills, determining what office you would like to run for, getting comfortable with networking or fundraising, etc. So today we'll be specifically focusing on combating imposter syndrome. Like I said, this is one of the top barriers that face women who are considering run for office. The feeling of I'm a fraud, there's no way I could do this, I'm not qualified enough, and recognizing too that this is something that impacts women across the spectrum, whether they are interested in running for office or pursuing any other type of endeavor in their careers or in leadership. All right, so we'll go ahead from there. We have this hashtag 250K by 2030. There are approximately 500,000 offices across the United States, and less than a third of them are occupied by women. 250,000 women running for office would represent women running for about half of the offices, equaling out the 50% of the population that women represent. So helping us to get to better representation by encouraging women to consider running for office. The challenge as currently exists is that women are significantly less underrepresented in office. And despite that being the case that when women do run, they win at the same rates as men. The trouble is they're just not running as often. So we are only going to achieve gender parity when we start seeing women running for office at higher rates. One of the solutions that She Should Run provides in a whole ecosystem of getting women to consider running for office is getting women to explore that possibility of leadership for them. So today's agenda, what we'll go through is we'll be talking about what imposter syndrome is and how you can identify it. We'll be talking through tips to ward off those feelings of imposterism. We'll go through what it means to tackle big goals, especially in lieu of feeling these things. And then we'll finish up with a conversation with Rosemary Ketchum, who is on the Wheeling City Council representing Ward 3. All right, so we're going to go again and get started with understanding imposter syndrome. You'll see here an image of a woman who's meant to represent royalty. She's surrounded by accomplishments, medals, awards. She has a crown on, yet when she looks at herself in the mirror, she sees confusion, doubt, and misunderstanding of herself. Imposter syndrome is defined as the crippling effect of self-doubt, intellectual inadequacy, and anticipated failure that haunts people who attribute their success to luck or help from others rather than their own abilities. So this term was coined in 1978 by two psychologists, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. They first noticed this challenge when they were interviewing women in leadership positions and university students. And they primarily and foremost saw this as a situation that existed among women. But later we're able to see that this exists across the board, that many interviewees who in their original study said that they lacked confidence, they had feelings of self-doubt, and they thought that their contributions were silly or fraudulent in comparison to other people next to them. These are some of the same ideas that we will use to attack ourselves when we're feeling like we are out of place or that we don't have a right to lead or be successful. We can put in the chat if there are any questions that you have about, do I experience imposter syndrome? Is this real? These two psychologists put together a quick self-survey. It's 20 questions. We'll put it in the chat so you have access to it after today's webinar, but it's a quick way for us to be able to examine, am I feeling imposter syndrome? Is this something that's holding me back from being successful? On the next slide, what we'll talk through is how are some ways is that imposter syndrome can manifest itself. So these show up in a variety of ways. You might experience all of these, you might experience only some of them. And either way, that doesn't detract from the fact that these are real feelings that can inhibit our ability to pursue big goals, to take on leadership opportunities, or to experience full success. So the first one is a difficulty accepting praise and recognition for personal accomplishments. This feeling that you are undeserving of the accomplishments that you've had, and that recognizing them would be inappropriate or misrepresented. The second is a reluctance to seize opportunities or take initiative, feeling that if you do so, you'll come into a piece of failure, or you'll make mistakes, and other people will recognize that you are a fraud. The third, a reluctance to accept promotions or new assignments because you don't feel like you're adequately ready for the next level. And you assume that anyone who is at that next level is much more successful and much more competent than you are. Next, a reluctance to highlight personal contributions or projects. This is often attributed as humility, and we use it as a way to say that we're doing something good. And we say that we aren't going to focus on our own competence or our own contributions or our own ways that we are experiencing or achieving success. We just diminish those and don't talk about them. The next is trouble delegating due to a need to ensure that everything is done to impossibly high standards, that we extend the high standards we have for ourselves to anyone who might be working on a team with us or who might share responsibility for a project with us. We feel that individualism is our burden to bear, and that if we ask for help, it's because we're weak and we couldn't do it alone. Next is procrastination, this feeling of paralysis or immobility because you're so afraid of making a mistake or experiencing failure. And finally, workaholism, the idea that while other people might be able to accomplish something in a standard workday, you have to work extended hours or work longer time, harder time, or put yourself through more because you are not at the same level as others around you. And that this need to be in a constant state of productivity is to make up for what you perceive you lack in comparison to those around you. So again, you might experience none of these, awesome. You might experience some, or you might experience all. It doesn't mean that you're bad or anything's wrong. It just means that imposter syndrome exists, and these are ways that we can start to identify it. Identifying it is the step that we need to take in order to move forward to addressing it. So we're going to talk just a little bit more about the difference between what imposter syndrome feels like versus what is happening in reality. You'll see on the left this image of what I know is small and what I perceive other people to know is great. And that is what imposter syndrome will always try to feed on, is this idea that you are smaller, less competent, less significant than your peers around you. When in reality, what you know is likely equal to your peers, you likely have equal competence, but the inability to know exactly what is happening in someone else's mind or someone else's skill set allows you to put together this distorted view of yourself compared to others. It's also important to recognize in the reality view that what you know might be of equal quantity to what other people know, but we all have different experiences and different skill sets. And so comparing your strengths to others' weaknesses or your weaknesses to other people's strengths provide an inaccurate comparison that limits your ability to see things clearly. Since 1978, when imposter syndrome was first identified, it has been said that about 70% of adults will experience imposter syndrome at some point in their lives or specifically in their careers. And most susceptible to these feelings are women, people of color, and members of the LGBTQ community because they receive signals throughout the entirety of their lives that they are less than or less important than others around them. So recognizing that it's important to take a beat, see and understand what you're experiencing and feeling so that you can better understand how you choose to respond. There's no way of knowing exactly what's going on in other people's minds, but you can take and pay attention to what you know, how you respond, and what you want to do with the information at hand. I've seen a lot of activity in the chat, so I'm just going to take a quick moment to take a look if there was any questions or any commentary here. I'm feeling like a lot of this resonates for some of you, and it resonates for me too. I was talking to coworkers of mine before even getting on here and thinking, how dare I come on and talk to so many women about imposter syndrome? What do I have to contribute? And completely diminishing the fact that I have spent a lot of time researching this subject. I've spent time preparing the content, and these feelings can creep up out of nowhere, and recognizing that you're not alone in having these feelings or experiences. It's also important to notice that there is no level of professional status that is exempt from these feelings. Dr. Margaret Chan, who was the director of the World Health Organization from 2006 to 2017, said about herself, "There's an awful lot of people out there who think that I'm an expert. How do these people believe all of this about me? I'm so much more aware of all the things that I don't know." Similarly, a hero of mine, Maya Angelou, shared, "Each time I write a book, every time I face that yellow pad, the challenge is so great. I have written 11 books, but each time I think, uh-oh, they're gonna find me out. I've run a game on everyone and they're going to find me out." Recognizing that even people who are at the highest levels of their career, who are considered experts, who are considered role models, who are considered exemplary at what they do, are still experiencing these same types of feelings of fraudulence, and that they have to combat them the same as you. So there are some ways to combat imposter syndrome, and we're going to go ahead and talk about that. The three main are being able to identify your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors. So the first is starting to recognize what your internal monologue sounds like when you're talking to yourself through imposter syndrome. This shows up in phrases like, if I ask a question, they're going to absolutely know that I'm clueless. Or thinking after being offered a position, I was lucky to get this position and it could have been anyone. This has nothing to do with my personal merits. Or thinking through, oh my goodness, my coworker or my classmate or my fellow volunteer is so much more successful than I am. Maybe I can just hide in their shadow and people won't notice that I don't belong here. Any of these feelings that start to diminish your personal contributions or your personal values are a #1 indicator that you're experiencing imposter syndrome. And instead of just letting them run rapid, you can start to engage with those thoughts. Ask yourself, why am I thinking this way? Or remind yourself, actually, I made this contribution in this way in this work project. That's probably why I'm in this place at this time. I can rely on my past experience to move forward from this. The next way to identify imposter syndrome is recognizing your feelings. This requires a lot of intentionality. Mindfulness has become a huge conversation that's happened in leadership circles, and the reason being is because it allows us to take control of our emotions rather than allowing our emotions to dictate our experience. When we talk about feelings associated with imposter syndrome, they're often fear, stress, anxiety, insecurity, or conflict. So if we start to have these feelings, particularly if they're associated with the thoughts I just mentioned, then we can know, okay, I'm starting to experience imposter syndrome. What should I do next? If you have these experiences mostly in your feelings, great tips are to take 10 breaths. Give yourself a chance to calm down your body and focus again on what your task at hand was. Other options are finding someone to have a conversation with and say, this is how I'm feeling, and I'd like to be able to use you as a support. Family members, therapists, trusted mentors are all great for having this way of self-identifying and inviting someone to support you as you go through this. Finally, the behaviors, what this shows up in our actual actions. This can show up as perfectionism and the need to have very high standards and vocalize those standards to everyone else, inviting harsh accountability against yourself from both yourself and others. Soloism, we talked about this a little bit in ways that imposter syndrome can manifest. You want to do projects by yourself. You don't like to collaborate with others, not because you don't invite the help, but because you're afraid that they might notice that you are not as good as they think you are, and you want to maintain the facade. So you do that by doing things on your own. Overskilling. This is when you go forward and say, I need X certification before I can go to the next level. I need a law degree before I can run for office. I need more experience in my current position before I'm eligible for a promotion. Any type of overdoing the need to perfect your skills before being willing to take on a new goal. And finally, we talked about this a bit already, but workaholism, when you putting in extra hours day and night, neglecting other responsibilities or neglecting self-care because you feel like your only job is to outperform in your time because you feel like you have a deficit in what you're offering in terms of intelligence, competence, or ability. So recognizing these behaviors, again, allows you to stop. If I'm someone who is a soloist, who I try to do everything on my own, I can invite a team to collaborate with me. I can acknowledge my tendency to work by myself and set up regular check-ins between us as a team so that we have an opportunity to collaborate, give feedback to one another. Oftentimes, by combating these behaviors and inviting things that interrupt them, we start to recognize that we don't rely on them. However, if we clutch to our need to be perfectionists, if we clutch to our needs to work alone, if we clutch to our needs to be workaholics, we'll never have the opportunity to interrupt those behaviors and don't get to have the positive benefits of experiencing something new. So again, moving into 4 ways to combat imposter syndrome. The first is focusing on the facts. So there are so many evidences to our credit, whether that be achievements we've had in the past, skills that we've acquired, capabilities that we know we've offered, and ways that we've experienced success to this point in our lives. Focusing on the facts forces us to take credit for our contributions. There are a variety of ways that you can do this, whether it's having a running note on your phone where you list out every accomplishment you've had, whether it's a trusted friend or family member who you share those with, whether it's having an email inbox where you share positive feedback that you've received from others. Have somewhere where you can document the successes that you've had up to this point, so that when you're feeling like you're not capable, you can go back to those standard reminders that you've done this in the past, and there's no reason to doubt that you will do it again in the future. The next is to challenge our limiting beliefs. So these are really deep-seated beliefs about what criteria for success actually are. When we start to have these limiting beliefs, we immediately beeline for focusing on the facts. When we go through and think, oh, I need to be X type of qualified, or I need to overskill in this way. Going through and reminding yourself all the different contributions that you've made in the past and what the qualifications might have been for those and how you exceeded them or how you met them, and keep them in a realistic perspective. Limiting beliefs often exaggerate qualifications and diminish our own contributions. So focusing on ways that we can become more realistic in our thinking, both by relying on past experience and also inviting ways to be real, honest with ourselves about what qualifications actually are versus what we perceive them to be. The next is claiming our strengths. So we have a tendency to, when we experience imposter syndrome, to want to focus on our weaknesses, to want to remind others and ourselves about all of the reasons why we're failures and all of the evidence that we have in favor of that belief. This is almost the exact opposite of focusing on the facts. We keep a running dialogue in our minds or in our hearts, or sometimes in written documentation of all of the ways that we failed. And we use this against ourselves when we're feeling like we're incapable to the task ahead of us. So claiming your strength invites you to advocate for yourself. In thinking about taking on new opportunities, reminding yourself about the skills and capabilities that you have and why this would be a unique and important opportunity for you. And finally, talking about it. Making sure that you have someone who you can be honest with, who you can admit that you're having these feelings of imposter syndrome, and you can invite a real and candid feedback. And it's important to note that talking about it, especially if you're asking for feedback, someone might be able to point out areas where you've made mistakes or maybe where you fell short. Experiencing imposter syndrome doesn't mean that you will never make a mistake. It means that you'll engage with mistakes that you make differently, that you can see mistakes as opportunities to grow and learn. When you have these types of conversations with someone who you trust and who cares about you and your success, you can talk about mistakes in realistic terms so that you can learn from them. And you can also get feedback to remind you of the ways that you contributed or had success. In addition to all of these four here, when you're in the midst of taking on a daunting challenge, it can be important to document the steps that you're taking throughout that experience. When you experience mistakes, you can go back and evaluate what you did in order to see where you would like to make changes. And when you experience success, you can repeat those behaviors and have greater confidence in doing repeated actions because you've already had success in your foundation and in your past experience to rely on. So one of the other opportunities that lives outside our own experience that can help us combat imposter syndrome is by having role models and people who can set the pace before us. In the realm of politics, this is why having more women in politics is so important. So many of the women, both in this photo, in our localities and in our states, have had to be the first woman to run in their area, have had to be the first woman to win in their area, and have had to face a myriad sexist attacks or feelings of being unqualified or whatever it else might be. However, because women have gone before us, we now have role models to look to, women with experiences similar to our own, women with backstories similar to our own, and we can say, all right, someone else who has experiences like me, who looks like me, who talks like me, who grew up in the town I grew up in, has done this. If she can do it, so can I. It's really important to have these role models. And one of the things that is shared by Lauren Romansky, who's the Vice President for HR at Gartner, says that we should always be looking for opportunities to work in spaces where we are able to see someone above us who we would like to grow into their footsteps. So this is a great opportunity to see how representation not only allows us to accomplish great good for our communities in elected office, but also helps to diminish collective imposter syndrome because we're contributing to better representation for ourselves and others. One of the reasons why this is also important for people externally is when there is underrepresentation, it requires external support to help convince the collectives that their imposter syndrome is not real. In terms of politics, this is things like gatekeepers and political operatives. It's so important for them to care about advancing representation for women, advancing representation for women of color, advancing representation for people in the LGBTQ community, is because without this representation, the imposter syndrome, instead of feeling fake, feels real, and you have greater evidence to compare it to reality. So making sure that there is collective ownership to undoing these systems that allow people to believe that they're less than. All right, so we're going to go into what does it mean in terms of pursuing big goals. When you have a big goal in front of you, it can feel, and you're experiencing imposter syndrome, it can feel like there's no way I will do this, especially since imposter syndrome diminishes the acceptance of risk and the interest in taking risk. So one of the ways that we can do this is to condition our bodies and our minds to take on risk. Think of this as muscle memory. So you're intentionally taking small risks frequently. This gives you endurance and experience with what it feels like to have the adrenaline rush or the confusion of taking risk and how to develop habits to engage with that. So if you have big goals in your future, what are small risks or small steps that you can take in pursuit of that big goal that will stretch your comfort zone and help you to get familiar with how you respond during risk? Then you can go back to the combating imposter syndrome steps that we talked about in terms of providing a foundation of your experience and capabilities that you've shown in the past and why taking on new risk will be something that you can do well. Next is to notice your triggers. If you're setting a big goal and in the process of setting that goal, you start to think, oh, I'm not qualified, or oh, no one like me has done this before. Instead of moving forward and just continuing to set the goal and putting even higher standards on yourself, stop while you're in the middle of writing the goal. Acknowledge these imposterism triggers and address them. Think about how they engage with the goal rather than letting them live in conjunction with that goal. As soon as you start to engage with these triggers that you're having and de-escalate them, you will no longer associate that goal in your mind with feelings of imposter syndrome, and it will make it much more easy and realistic for you to pursue that goal. The third, and I really hope that you've heard me at this point, acknowledging your skills, finding a way to be honest with yourself about what it is that you contribute. Some of you, as I asked at the opening of this webinar, what was your biggest accomplishment that you're proud of, said it was hard to answer. This is true for so many people. Taking time to sit down and acknowledge our successes, acknowledge our contributions, acknowledge our skills and abilities can be extremely difficult, can be paralyzing. It's important that we dedicate time to really acknowledging what skills and capabilities we bring to the table, and that we allow ourselves to believe in the validity of those. If we're ever going to be able to move past that into greater skill, greater opportunity, we're going to have to believe that we have a reason to be there. And acknowledging the skills that we've brought to the table up to this stage is one of the key ways that we do that. Next is changing your mindset about failure. So many times, I in fact have a mantra that I had to completely undo in my mind. That mantra was, I hate doing things I'm bad at. And I told myself this over and over and over again, particularly as a young girl in middle school, high school, and in college. I hate doing things I'm bad at. I started to associate failure with I am a failure. As I was trying new things, of course I was bad at them because they were new to me. I didn't have the skills to engage with them. My failures were not indicative of my personal lack of ability. They were indicative of my novice in this space. Engaging with failure as a way to learn instead of a manifestation of your worth is a key part of engaging with new goals. Accepting that you will make mistakes, and also everyone will make mistakes as they try new things, is an important belief system to have in order to move forward with scary, audacious goals, like running for office. You are not going to be good at every single thing you try, especially when you try it for the first time. But you can use opportunities like failures to learn and to progress. This is also another reason why it's so great to have a mentor who can guide you through it, which brings us to our next point, which is to invite feedback. Inviting people who we trust to give us feedback, whether it be positive or whether it be constructive. Acknowledging that the feedback is coming out of a place of trust and an investment in your bettering of yourself. Asking for feedback is vulnerable, but it allows us to control the environment in which we have the conversations and the people who we receive that from. So thinking about people in your life who you want to give a purview into everything that you're working through and working to accomplish, so that you can have the feedback you need in order to improve and grow. Also, people hear feedback and immediately assume it's only constructive. I hope you heard me when I also said positive. Receiving feedback from others will also help you to acknowledge your skills, because you can hear it from a source outside your own mind. When other people validate the successes that you've had, you can put that in a bank of remembering your skills, remembering that you have abilities. Make sure that you're documenting the positive feedback as well as the constructive. Use the constructive to move forward rather than beat yourself up. Use the positive as a foundation of information that you can use as you move forward, tackling new things. And finally, is a support system, building a support system. You are going to need people in your corner who are the feedback people, but you're also going to need people who are the hype people, who are in your corner no matter what, who truly believe that you can accomplish anything and are super supportive as you go through it. Recognizing that these are the people who you can come to whether you're in tears or whether you're in joy, and that they will be supportive of whatever emotions you bring to the table. As you take on new goals, it's going to be scary, and there are going to be times when you feel less than, or feel scared, or feel any of those feelings in the list we talked about earlier. Having a strong support system of family, friends, mentors, and colleagues allows us to get varied perspectives and varied types of support, from unconditional love to tough feedback, to a second voice to whatever it is that you are trying to accomplish. Determining who and how people will engage in your support system is an important decision to make. And maybe you want to sit down and actually write out, this person is my support for when I'm crying. For me, that's my mother. If I'm upset and stressed out, I'm going to my mother. She will be on my type squad no matter what. If I want more candid feedback and I want to work through skill building, I go through to my mentor, a former boss of mine who is really committed to my continued success, who provides a safe space for me to try and fail and practice before I go and do things for real. If I want more candid feedback on how I'm showing up or if I'm communicating clearly, I talk to my sister, recognizing that there are people in your corner and that they can have formal roles. And thinking through how they show up in your support system and identifying those roles can help you in when you're having intense feelings of imposter syndrome to know who in your support system to contact. So we're going to go ahead and pause there. I will introduce Rosemary Ketchum. I do see that there are a couple questions in the Q&A box already. I'll be pulling through to these and we'll start to talk through them. We also have a couple questions that were prepared in advance. So just know that I'm seeing these all come through and we'll work through these together. But first I'll go ahead and introduce Rosemary. Rosemary Ketchum is a member of the City Council of Wheeling, West Virginia, representing Ward 3. She's also an Associate Director for the National Alliance on Mental Illness Greater Wheeling Drop-In Center and on the boards of several organizations, including the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy. She has served as a guest on MSNBC and The Today Show and has been profiled by several publications, including Time Magazine, CBS, and CNN for her work in community organizing and politics. We are very fortunate to have her with us today. And so, Rosemary, I'll go ahead and welcome you in. And if there's anything you'd like to say as a personal introduction, please feel free.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Oh my gosh, if we could just take a moment to thank you for leading us through this session and to acknowledge, the power of vulnerability here. We all have to come to this from a vulnerable place of self-learning, and I'm so grateful for that. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you and I spoke earlier this week about you coming into this session, and we wanted to start with what has imposter syndrome looked like for you, especially as you took on your campaign and running for office. What experiences can you share with women who are here today?
Yeah, so many of the points that you made earlier, ring true for me. And I felt imposter syndrome before I knew there was a word for it. I think that so many of the kind of feelings that we have around imposter syndrome really begin in childhood, based on our environments and our, parental systems. And, for me, I really feel that's where it began. My parents, for better or for worse, hyped me up all day long, every day. I felt like I was a superhero in my family. And it took me actually getting into the real world to realize that, wait a minute, maybe I'm not a superhero. And so they gassed me up in the most loving way, but I needed a reality check. And I think that I was homeschooled throughout my, middle school, most of my K through 12 education, which I'm grateful for. As a trans person, folks experience a lot of, danger and, potential assault in school. So I was grateful that my parents gave me that opportunity, but I also wasn't able to kind of compare my journey and my growth to other kids, again, for better or for worse. And so it wasn't until I went into college did I feel this kind of immense pressure to outperform and to, kind of compare my journey with the people that I, was going to school with. That's when I can remember first feeling, this sense of imposter syndrome.
Yeah, which can be such a big deal and so key to a personal experience, and also experiencing it for the first time at the beginnings of adulthood, right? When you're out on your own, which can set a tone for how you move forward. I feel like you've done exquisitely at moving past that. And I know that you work a lot with mental health. It's evident that you care about that in your own life. I'm curious, what foundation do you go to when you have these feelings of imposterism? What do you do to navigate that?
Great question. Before I knew there was a word for it, I definitely enabled myself to feel these things, compared myself to other students, kind of, beat myself up for things I couldn't control, which I think is a lot of, a kind of common behavior among folks who experience imposter syndrome. I'm a first generation college student, and I remember feeling the weight of that on my shoulders and kind of feeling unprepared and maybe even unworthy for the experience of going to college. I was also a non-traditional student. I went a little later. I took a kind of year sabbatical between high school and college. And all of those things kind of were swirling around in my brain. But for me, being able to center myself in my own values has been really powerful, because one of the, things that really gets me is kind of institutional knowledge. That's where I feel oftentimes the most insecure. Anecdotally, one of my first experiences on a board was in college. I represented our student body on our board of governors. And it was the first time I'd ever been in the room where it happens, so to speak. And, I remember walking into this room. I was young. Everybody at the table was literally 2 to 3 times my age. And they had all of this institutional knowledge, and they were throwing around acronyms and phrases and, West Virginia law and code, and I knew nothing. And I felt totally out of place. And rather than feeling empowered to represent the student body, I felt incredibly insecure. And so rather than admitting that to folks and seeking help, I pretended I knew what everybody was talking about. And then I'd go home later and research notes. But, kind of securing myself and my values rather than, measuring my self-worth based on my institutional knowledge or kind of being able to recite facts from rote memory has been incredibly helpful, because, I don't think that institutional knowledge or being able to recite facts from rote memory is, a sign of intelligence or merit, truthfully. I think that when you're able to, again, secure yourself in your values, whatever those are, mine are vulnerability, authenticity, honesty. When you're able to acknowledge those and lead from that space, for me, that has been the most helpful in kind of being unapologetically authentic. And pushing those feelings of imposter syndrome away.
Yeah, I love that. I love using your value system as a way to direct where you're going and what you're doing, and recognizing, okay, like I may not have what this person on the board with me is contributing, but I do have my values to contribute and my perspective to contribute, and that has inherent value. I think that that's such an important way to engage with thinking about that. We had received a couple of questions in advance of the session from a couple of young people, and you mentioned that you started on your first board when you were in college. What advice would you have for young people who are maybe in college right now who want to run for office one day, but currently feel inadequate in that endeavor? What would you say to help them get prepared?
The most important preparation for me was my own mental preparation for it, because it's not easy to run for office. And I think a lot of folks are most afraid of this kind of the mental Olympics you have to engage in to be a politician or to be a candidate. And for me, being able to surround myself with a coalition of folks who believed similar things, had the same value systems that I did, was integral, because I wasn't going it alone, and I ran a relatively humble city council campaign, but I built a team of people, a PR team, somebody to help me with canvassing, somebody to help me with other things. And I can't help but think if I had done that alone, I probably wouldn't have won. I probably wouldn't have had I wouldn't have had the kind of self-esteem to feel capable or like I had a, team with me. And so while I probably could have done it alone, being at a relatively small race, the team that I was able to build around me was absolutely powerful in that. And it's so strange now in COVID world. I ran my race prior to COVID, and then the end part during the pandemic. It's really hard to organize, and it's really hard to build teams right now. I think that folks are being creative, which is great. I mean, we're doing this webinar, which I'm so grateful for. But this time really requires, I think, creativity and vulnerability with folks. So my biggest suggestion would be to, pull those people in who are in your corner and maybe have, experiences that you do not, and that makes them inherently valuable. It doesn't mean you have to compare yourself or be upset that you don't have those set of experiences. That's just what they have in their toolbox. And, Brené Brown is one of my favorite authors, and I'm sure a lot of folks on this webinar are familiar with her, but she talks about the toolbox, that we all have our unique toolbox, which we, build from. And I think that that's a really wonderful way to kind of visualize our own skills and values and capabilities. And so I think that's, one of the most important things is building a good team with a lot of tools.
No, absolutely. And I think this is a couple of questions that we've seen both today and in the past is, what does it look like to actually build that team? How did you find these people, and how did you invite them to be in support of you?
Yeah, I mean, I had to get over the, insecurities of leading a team. I'd never really led a team that large or, with that high of stakes. And, I read all the leadership books I could. I, watched all the TED Talks that exist around leadership. And for me, I found that really being able to, understand and learn from the experiences of leaders that I admire was the most helpful thing in building a team that was a winning team. I read Becoming by First Lady Michelle Obama during my campaign. And it was one of the most formative experiences for me because she talks about these feelings of imposter syndrome. She talks about, being a really incredible lawyer in the 1980s, but still feeling unprepared or unqualified for her position. And I admire Michelle Obama like nobody else. And so I thought, my goodness, if this is how she felt, this badass woman, then I probably have no, no worries to kind of, build a team that I'm proud of. And so I pulled in my best friends, I pulled in my, closest allies. And again, that was, I think, integral in kind of helping my own mental health running for office, because it's a labor. But it also, I think, was really influential in winning the race.
I love that. And something I'll just add too as well. I've noticed that going to your friends or family, people who you have closer connections with, can be the people who are easy to go to first. Mm-hmm. But a question that I have found so important in asking those people is, who do you know who has X skill? Or who do you know that you could introduce me who will help me achieve this? Because our circle is filled with so many more connections that we might not be associated with. And that part of building that support system is asking for the connection of who they have in their circle.
Right. And I think oftentimes anybody in a leadership position feels the pressure of having to be, having to have all the knowledge or know absolutely everything. And there, I think, is inherent power in saying, actually, I don't know, but we're going to find somebody who does, or you have skills that I don't. That makes you valuable. Can you join my team? There's a reason why know-it-alls are not attractive people. They're not folks that we necessarily love to befriend because there's something strange or odd about their behavior. Of course, in mental health and psychology, we know folks who, exhibit those behaviors are often the most insecure, but there is inherent power and there is an opportunity to trust build by being vulnerable and saying, actually, I have no idea what I'm talking about and I need help here. And I've only, I've been in elected office for about a month and a half, almost 2 months. And there have been moments where I've said, I know exactly what I'm talking about. This is my lane. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm going to need some help. And so not feeling the pressure to be an expert on everything, I think, is a great way to treat yourself and to help your mental health.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most liberating announcements we can make is, I don't know everything. There are going to be things that I'm learning along the way. And it's so much more honest, one, but two, liberating to say, I'm going to learn and I'm going to move in that direction versus trying to be the person who knows everything at all times.
Right.
So I had mentioned during my remarks that it's most helpful if there's someone in a position that we would like to pursue that looks like us, that we have someone who represents us already there so that we can then pursue that. That was not a luxury that you had. You ran in West Virginia, the first trans woman elected in West Virginia. What was it like for you to move forward as a first? And what recommendations would you have for any other women on this call who might be a first in something that they're pursuing?
Yeah, so representation matters a whole lot in feelings of imposter syndrome. And when we don't have our values or our lived experience modeled for us, on a national stage or on a stage that we admire, it makes it really difficult to envision ourselves in this space. In my work as a mental health provider here in the state of West Virginia, a lot of my clients, we cover the topics around our own kind of negative feedback loops in our brain, the kind of things we tell ourselves consistently about ourselves. And I think we all have them and they all kind of lend to deeper insecurities. But my most common, negative feedback loops are, who do you think you are? And you're not prepared, or you're not enough. Or, what makes you think you can do what you want to do? And I feel like those are pretty common, and they're only exacerbated when there isn't a model or isn't an example of, your lived experience or your leadership. So for me, I had to get past that and say, yes, there may not be another trans person on this council or, in the state who is open and legislating, but that is an opportunity rather than a detriment. It provides me an opportunity to represent the state in a more progressive way. West Virginia, unfortunately, does not receive the most flattering perceptions from people across the state. I've been to various conferences and people go, "Oh my gosh, West Virginia, what the hell happens there?" And bless their heart. But I think that for me, I was able to reframe it. And I think a lot of the conversations around imposter syndrome require us to reframe our perceptions around self-worth, value, and productivity. I think what you said before really made sense. But yeah, for me, being able to look nationwide and saying, we're at a moment in our history here in America that I think is an inflection point in progress, regardless of your political party, being able to embrace the future in a thoughtful way really made me feel good about running my race. Win, lose, or draw. I wasn't sure I was going to win, and yet I felt really confident and comfortable being able to maybe be a first somewhere. So that, but it also helped me to see other women or leaders like, First Lady Michelle Obama really be vulnerable and acknowledge their experience. That made me feel included and part of something I didn't understand before.
Oh, I love that. And I love that you brought in the part about acknowledging where you're from. I'm from Florida. So, I'm used to people taking jabs at my state and acknowledging that there are overcompensations that I sometimes feel the need to make, even just from the state I'm in, and recognizing that there's so much that we can use as negative feedback loops to ourselves to say that we don't belong. And I appreciate you for acknowledging a variety of those as you've gone for your race, as you're now serving. I think that you're just a great example of how to combat those feelings and those thoughts that come up. One of the questions that we've had is, how can you build confidence in the community that you want to serve so that they trust you, especially as a young person? How can you build confidence for the community to trust you that you will serve them well?
First, you have to be invested in the community. I never planned to run for office. That really wasn't in the cards for me. I didn't think, partly because I did not see myself, represented in politics here in the state or nationwide. But I had been working as a community organizer for years before thinking of running for office, investing in my community, working on issues like racial justice, LGBTQ justice, menstrual equity, these issues that matter a whole lot to the folks in my community, access to voting rights. And it just seemed like the most natural, progression to potentially run for office. And had I not built those foundations and those relationships, I probably wouldn't have won, and I probably wouldn't have deserved to win, truthfully, because, politics is not, a one-woman show. It requires a team of people who trust that you're going to be able to represent their best interests. And so had I not done that work prior and earned that trust, I'm not sure that, I would have been the best person for the job. But, community organizing is what I love most. I'm taking those kind of skills and abilities into elected office. But I think also being able to relate to your community in an authentic way is incredibly important. One of the topics that I think often is maybe under expressed in regards to imposter syndrome is, people who grow up in poverty. I grew up in poverty here in the Ohio Valley, in West Virginia and Ohio, and all of the things that I thought were possible, or that I think are possible now, I did not think was possible when I was, an adolescent and a young adult, because my, childhood experiences in poverty really shaped what I thought, was possible for me. And, that lends to, I think, an extra layer or a complex layer of imposter syndrome. Or, do you belong here? Do you know enough? I don't come from a family of politicians. I don't come from a place of money, and it takes a lot of money to run for office. So I think being able to bring that lived experience to the race and say, hey, I'm not a carpetbagger from out of town wanting your vote. I grew up here. I love the place. I relate to your own experiences. And, I'm willing to take this knowledge and this lived experience to, the chambers of government. And I think that was really helpful in building trust in my community.
Yeah, I love that, right? Like being visible, being engaged. I think that your passion comes through, and anyone else who have a similar passion level, that your community will respond to that. So we're winding down to our last question, and I've heard some of these throughout our conversation today about focusing on your values, focusing on your skills and passions, but what would be your 2 to 3 things that you do to build personal confidence?
Great question. I love to learn. I think a kind of sign of intelligence is acknowledging what you do not know. And there are a lot of things that I do not know. And so being able to dive in to, books and webinars and ask people who I'm interesting questions. I think that too often, of course we all love to hear ourselves speak, but being able to engage another person in a thoughtful way and ask questions about their lived experience, that makes me feel confident, because we all have something to share. We all have something to learn from one another. But also being able to work on my own mental health is absolutely key. Being able to understand that my self-worth cannot and should not be measured by my own productivity. Being able to understand the difference between shame and guilt. Brene Brown says shame is I am bad, guilt is I did bad. We all have these kind of thoughts in our brain, these negative feedback loops that we try to measure ourselves by. And we're probably, gonna live with those for the rest of our life. There's oftentimes the world is toxic in so many ways, and we just have to build up a shield. But being able to every single day work on my mental health, acknowledge when I feel good and when I don't feel good, has been the most valuable thing for me. And I'm privileged. I get to work in, the field of mental health, so I don't have a choice but to think of it. But I think that I hope that as a country, we can really begin to shift our focus toward a more holistic, comprehensive space that involves mental health, because we are experiencing a mental health crisis in the United States that I don't think we've ever experienced at this level before. So we can't afford to ignore it anymore. And I think that we can do a lot of good in combating imposter syndrome if we're able to acknowledge how we feel in relation to, a kind of toxic environment.
Excellent. Rosemary, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's such an honor to hear from you. Ladies here in the chat, I have seen your questions about mentors. I've seen your questions about asking for money. We've not been able to get to every single one of those today. However, there are opportunities for you to receive answers to those questions or continue asking those questions in the She Should Run community. We do have a short evaluation, like I mentioned at the beginning. It's 3 minutes long. So if you'll take a chance to fill that out, the link is in the chat coming from Melissa. Again, if you'll just take a moment to respond to that evaluation, we'd greatly appreciate it. It's about 3 minutes long, so it should not take you long at all. Moving from here, a couple things to keep in mind is participating in the She Should Run community. Participating in the community, we have more than 21,000 women in this community. It's a chance to ask questions. I've seen that you've all enjoyed the chat so much. It's an opportunity to continue to engage with other women who have similar questions to you or who might have advice. Our next webinar is happening next week. It is how to stay informed this election season. So we invite you to register for that. And then again, if you can just give us some feedback by filling out that evaluation, we would be very grateful. This webinar and all webinars from She Should Run are made possible because they are a labor of love for us, but also by generous donations from participants like yourself. So many of you participated in donating during the registration, which we greatly appreciate and want to thank you for doing that. If you would like to support future webinars like this or helping women consider running for office, we appreciate all the generous support that comes to us through donations. You can see that at sheshouldrun.org/donate. A link is available in the chat. Thank you again for being here today, for supporting us, for joining with us. I look forward to all that you will accomplish. I hope that you will take time to recognize the accomplishments that you are making. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. We're happy to engage with each of you at any point later on. So again, thank you for being here. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon.